The Abandoned Cabin by Thomas B. There are some places that just feel wrong. I've always believed that. Somewhere in the pit of your stomach, you can tell when something isn't quite right. That's how I felt about the cabin in the woods near my grandparents' old property. Growing up, we weren't supposed to go near it. But being kids, we didn't listen. And I regret every second we spent there. I grew up spending summers at my grandparents' farm. It was in a small, rural town, surrounded by acres of thick forest. On the edge of the property, maybe a 10-minute walk into the woods, stood an old, dilapidated cabin. It was more of a shack, really. Rotten wood, a collapsed roof, and windows so dirty you couldn't see inside. My grandparents never mentioned it, but one summer, when I was about 12, my cousin Tommy and I decided to explore. The walk to the cabin felt longer than it should have. The deeper we went into the woods, the quieter everything became. No birds, no insects, just our footsteps crunching on the leaves. When we finally arrived, the place looked even worse up close. It felt like we were being watched. There was something unsettling about the air around that cabin, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Being curious kids, we crept closer. The door was hanging off its hinges, so we slipped inside. The smell hit us first. Musty, rotten wood mixed with something else. Something sickly sweet. The inside was empty, aside from a few pieces of broken furniture and an old, rusted stove in the corner. But the weirdest thing was the walls. They were covered in carvings, hundreds of tiny scratches, almost like tally marks, but with no rhyme or reason. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the grooves, but Tommy called me over to the back room before I could inspect further. That's when we found the photographs. They were scattered across the floor. Old, black and white photos, too faded to make out much detail. Most of them showed people, but their faces were blurred or scratched out. There was one photo, though, clearer than the rest. It showed the cabin, and in the doorway stood a woman, her face turned slightly away from the camera. But something about her seemed off, like her proportions weren't quite right. We both felt it at the same time. A chill creeping up our spines. Tommy, who was always the braver one, said we should leave, and for once, I didn't argue. We ran all the way back to the farm, the feeling of being watched never leaving us. For a few days, everything seemed normal. We didn't mention the cabin to my grandparents, but every time I glanced toward the woods, I felt that same unease. One night, while we were all sitting in the living room, the air grew heavy. The dogs, usually playful, were silent, staring at the window as if they sensed something we couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m., my heart racing for no reason. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, until I heard it. A tapping sound, slow and deliberate. I thought it was coming from the window, but when I sat up, I realized it was coming from the front door. I crept to the window and peeked out, expecting to see one of the dogs, or maybe a tree branch. But standing at the edge of the woods, just barely visible in the moonlight, was the figure of a woman. She was facing the cabin, her back turned to me, but I knew, deep down, that it was the woman from the photograph. My blood ran cold. The next day, I told my grandparents what I had seen. My grandfather, usually a quiet man, went pale. He told us we were never supposed to go near the cabin, that something wasn't right with that place. He wouldn't say much more, but I could tell he knew something. My grandmother looked scared too, which was unusual for her. I never went back to the cabin, but Tommy did. He always had more courage. Or maybe it was stubbornness. A week after I left for home, my grandparents called to tell me Tommy had gone missing. They found him near the cabin, lying face down in the clearing, like he had just fallen asleep. But there was something strange about his body. It was covered in those same tiny scratches we had seen on the cabin walls. The authorities called it an accident, but no one could explain the scratches, and no one ever mentioned the cabin again. I haven't been back to that place since, but every once in a while, I dream about the woman in the doorway. In the dream, she's always just turning toward me, but I wake up before I can see her face, and part of me is glad I never have. The Disappearing Neighbor by Emily T. You know those towns where everyone knows each other, where people wave at you from their porches and gossip at the local diner? That's the kind of town I grew up in. Quiet, peaceful, nothing out of the ordinary. Until something happened to the house next door. It wasn't abandoned, but it was like the people living there just faded out. And after all these years, I still can't explain what I saw. It all started when Mrs. Hollis, our elderly neighbor, passed away. She'd been living next door for as long as I could remember, but after she died, the house sat empty for a few months. Then, one day, a moving truck pulled up. A couple moved in. John and Sylvia, late 30s maybe, normal enough. We didn't see much of them at first, but eventually, they started showing up to town events. You know, those church barbecues, summer fairs, that sort of thing. Sylvia seemed sweet, but John, he was always just a bit off. Not in a way that raised alarms, but you couldn't quite get a read on him. He smiled too much, never made much eye contact. You know the type, polite, but something didn't sit right. One summer evening, I was out mowing the lawn when John waved me over from his yard. He asked if I could help him with something inside, moving some furniture around. Seemed innocent enough, so I went in. The house was mostly normal, except for the smell. Not like garbage or anything. It was sweet, almost like rotting fruit. John didn't mention it, so neither did I. We moved a few things, and he thanked me. But the whole time, I felt this creeping sensation that something was wrong. A few weeks later, I started hearing strange noises coming from their house late at night. Thuds, like furniture being dragged. And once I swore I heard muffled voices, more like a faint argument, but distorted, like it wasn't coming from just one person. It sounded wrong. I assumed they were just moving things around, but it was happening almost every night. One night, around 2 a.m., the sounds were louder than usual. My curiosity got the best of me, and I peeked out the window. Sylvia was standing in the yard, staring up at her house, but she wasn't moving. She was barefoot, wearing what looked like a nightgown, and she stood there for at least 10 minutes. I didn't see John anywhere. I almost called out to her, but something stopped me. I was too uneasy. Then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, She turned and went back inside without looking around, like she was in some sort of trance. A few days later, I noticed something strange. Sylvia was gone. I mean, I didn't see her for days. I asked around, but no one else seemed to care. I knocked on their door, and John answered. He looked rough, tired, pale, like he hadn't slept in days. I asked about Sylvia, and he just smiled and said she was visiting family. The way he said it, though, sent chills down my spine. The noises continued every night. I finally called the sheriff after a particularly loud night, banging so intense it woke me up. The sheriff came by the next morning, knocked on John's door, and spoke with him for a bit. Nothing came of it. The sheriff just told me that John said everything was fine, that Sylvia was out of town. Weeks passed, and there was still no sign of Sylvia. I asked John again, and he brushed it off like it was nothing. Then, one night, the noises stopped. One evening, after months of eerie silence, I was out for a walk when I saw a moving truck again, parked outside John's house. I asked one of the movers if the family was leaving, but they didn't know. Said they were just there to clear the place out, that the owners had requested it. A few days later, the sheriff told me that John had left town suddenly. No one knew where he went. The house sat empty for months, and eventually it was sold. I'd almost put the whole thing out of my mind, until one day I bumped into the sheriff at the diner. He looked uneasy and pulled me aside. He told me that after John left, they found something in the basement. Behind a false wall, there was a hidden room. The smell down there was unbearable, and in the corner, they found traces of blood and something else. Hair. The sheriff didn't tell me much more, but his face said everything. Sylvia had never left. To this day, no one knows where John went, or what really happened in that house. But sometimes, when I pass by, I swear I can still hear the faint sounds of furniture being moved. The Man in the Field by Sharon R. There's a field near the edge of town, surrounded by trees, that's always given me the creeps. People say that back in the 1920s, a man disappeared there without a trace. I never believed in ghost stories, but after what happened to me, I'm not sure what to believe anymore. When I was a teenager, my friends and I used to dare each other to walk through that field at night. It wasn't anything special, just an open stretch of grass with a few scattered trees. But there was something about it, especially at night, that felt wrong. The air always seemed colder there, the trees too still, and the ground, even though it was solid, felt like it could swallow you whole if you stayed too long. People in town used to say the field was cursed, that it was the last place someone had seen a man named Joseph Klein before he vanished without a trace. I thought it was just an old urban legend, until I saw him myself. One autumn night, after a few beers, my friends dared me to spend the night in the field. Being the foolhardy kid I was, I accepted. I packed a flashlight, my phone, and a jacket, and set out around midnight. The walk was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the grass. I set up camp near the center of the field, sat down, and waited. At first, nothing happened. I started to relax, thinking my friends had been messing with me. But then, around 1 a.m., I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. He was tall, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothes, like something out of the 1920s. He was just standing there, perfectly still, staring at me. I figured it was one of my friends trying to scare me, so I called out. But the man didn't move. He didn't react at all. I started walking toward him, but as I got closer, something strange happened. It was like the air around him was thick. Every step I took felt heavier, like I was walking through water. And then, as I reached the halfway point, he vanished. Not like he turned and walked away. He just disappeared. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what I had just seen. That's when I noticed the ground. The grass around where the man had been standing was blackened, like it had been burned. But there was no fire, no smoke, just dead grass forming a perfect circle. I didn't waste any time after that. I turned and ran, faster than I ever have in my life. But as I reached the edge of the field, I felt it. A hand, cold and firm, gripping my shoulder. I spun around, expecting to see the man, but there was no one. Nothing but the field, stretching out behind me. I could still feel the icy pressure on my shoulder, though, even as I bolted back toward town. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched no matter where I went. I felt those cold eyes on me, and every time I passed the field, I saw him, just standing there, waiting. I've heard others talk about seeing the man in the field since then. They always describe him the same way. Tall, still, and watching. Some people say he's waiting for something. Others say he's trapped. I don't know what he is, or why he's there. But I do know one thing. If you ever see him, don't go near the field. And whatever you do, don't look back.